Alright, let me ask you a question. What is one thing that nearly every Sonic game has in common? And if you really think about it, you won't get a solid answer besides the fact that, well, Sonic appears in all of them. Over the years, Sonic games have been inconsistent in quality. We would get a great game one year and a complete snooze fest the next. Sonic's game catalog has always been a mixed bag. We have a lot of good games, but we also have a lot of bad games. However, one thing that most Sonic games never seem to fail at is their soundtracks. No matter how bad the game is, it will have great music, but there are some exceptions to this. So yeah, not all Sonic games have a good soundtrack, but each one is at the very least consistent. Pretty much every soundtrack in the series had consistent sound design and theming throughout. That was until 2023, which saw the release of Sonic Superstars, and as more people played the game, the discussion surrounding the game's soundtrack became more common. This game has one of the weirdest soundtracks out of any Sonic game. Some tracks in this game are beautifully composed and sound straight out of games like Sonic Mania and Sonic CD, but then we also have tracks that sound like they're ripped from Sonic 4 because they attempt a more classic feel by using Genesis instrumentation. Because of this, the entirety of Sonic Superstars' soundtrack is just very inconsistent. But it wasn't always supposed to be this way. As it turns out, the Sonic Superstars soundtrack was once fully composed of those Genesis sounding tracks. That was before Sega probably looked at it and said, hey, what if we got more composers on this project? Thus, the composers' clashing styles created the diversity that the soundtrack is infamous for nowadays. But how do I know this? Well, if you've played through Superstars and made it to the credits, you may have noticed different versions of some of the stage themes playing in the background. Notably, these versions of the tracks use completely different sound fonts. They're using a similar sound to the other Genesis tracks in the game. Now, you might be saying, well, maybe they just made these versions for the credits. And that isn't true because full versions of the tracks were found in the game files at launch. So let's take a listen to one of them. Wow man, that's an insane difference. This composition of Bridge Island is nothing like the final version, as it uses different instruments. I also kind of like how it's much calmer than it is in the final release. It feels nostalgic in a way, and it reminds me of games like Sonic 3D Blast. It feels ripped straight out of that game. Obviously, I do like the newer version better, but the original has a certain charm to it. However, even the Genesis tracks in the final game had earlier versions that sounded pretty different. For example, here's Press Factory Act 1. To get technical with it, this version of the track sounds much different because it uses X-Pand2 instruments, while the final version uses those instruments along with YM2612 instruments, which were also used on the Genesis. However, I still really like the original track more. The newer version of Press Factory just feels way more aggressive and ear-piercing. It's not a very pleasant listen. I think using the other instruments was a much better choice. Holy shit, man, this sounds pretty bad compared to the final version if you ask me. The same melodies are here, but the newer instruments just fit the theme of the level so much better. And this earlier track is composed entirely of the X-Pan 2 instruments, while the newer track has much more high quality instruments. Now, I also want to talk about the Cyberstation boss. In the final game, the theme has a more retro feel as it uses chiptune. However, there is an unused version that uses actual instruments, and in my opinion, it sounds way better. Take a listen. I understand why they went for chiptune instead, because it does fit with the rest of the zone, but I do like the original track better. But those are just some examples of how the soundtrack of Sonic Superstars used to be much different. There are a ton of earlier tracks that were found in the game's files. A lot of them have very subtle changes, but there are some more that sound considerably different, like the ones featured in this video. I would recommend checking out Superstars' page on the cutting room floor to learn more about the tracks. I'll leave a link down below. But now, there's one question left to answer. Why did they only choose to remake some of the tracks? Well, if I had to guess, it was probably due to a lack of budget. Making music takes time, man, let alone completely overhauling a track with different instruments. Time constraints also most likely played a role in the whole thing, so they couldn't just get every track to be on the same level. And that does kinda suck. It would have been awesome if the entirety of Superstars' soundtrack was on the same level as Lagoon City Act 2, or Bridge Island Act 1, or Speed Jungle. But as it is now, it's one of the most inconsistent Sonic OSTs. But that's going to end this video. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you all later. Goodbye.